I just want to make sure it's recording. Good. Well, you're not upside down anymore, David. Good. Okay. Shall we start?
Sure.
Okay. I have a few questions here. So, tell me about the first time you heard. Okay, I'm just gonna edit the video anyways.
Yeah.
So, well, I actually put it in the subtitle. It's okay. I'm just gonna put your name and architect firm or. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so David, when was the first time you were at Yorkville?
So I think the first time I was there was my Aunt Elaine is a painter, and she's an American. So she came up, and so when I was about 7 or 8, I think, she wanted to paint Yorkville. She'd heard about Yorkville. Even in the United States, she'd heard about
How
it.
did she hear about it?
Who knows? Who knows?
Okay.
But it was like, it was like one of the 4 or 5 places you knew about. Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco, and Soho in New York, and so on and so forth. So somehow she'd heard about it.
Yeah.
So she wanted to paint. So she set up her easel and painted. And so my mom still has about 3 or 4 of the paintings from that session. But it's interesting because although we walked through the hippie part of Yorkville, she actually did the paintings on the back streets. So we spent most of our time on the back streets, and I was bored out of my tree. I was absolutely bored out of my tree.
Okay.
Right, but and that was probably the only time I was in Yorkville when Yorkville was Yorkville, right? Because by the time I came to Toronto in 1979 or 80, Yorkville wasn't really Yorkville anymore, right? It was another thing. It's what it is now, or close to what it is now, or halfway to being what it is now. But it wasn't the hippie. It wasn't quite the hippie enclave that it had been.
So the first time you went to Yorkville, it was that hippie.
Yeah, but I was very young. Yeah, and so what I remember, I remember it just exactly the way you might imagine it.
Yeah.
Lots of people who look like me, who didn't wash very much,
Oh no.
whose clothes were dirty,
Okay.
who were 17 or 18, not 55, right? And who were sitting around playing guitars on the street, and whatever. Like it was a very busy. It was a very busy pedestrian place. I remember it was houses.
Yeah.
And then every house, even before the hippie invasion, every house on Yorkville had hard landscaping.
Yeah.
So you could sit, if you were prepared to sit on the ground, you could sit on the ground and do whatever, right?
Yeah.
What I don't remember, which is interesting, but it has to have been true because there were other places I went to. What I don't remember is the smell of pot.
Which one?
What I don't remember is pot in Yorkville. I must have been. There had to have been pot in Yorkville when I went there when I was 7 or 8.
You were probably too young and too innocent.
Well, but there were other places that I went to where I smelled it, and I would bug my parents about it and so on. So like that part. But I don't remember it, right? Remember I was very young, right?
So that was your first impression from Yorkville, and the second time you went there when you were in your 20s, right?
In my 20s, and actually a lot of what I did then in Yorkville was, because I put myself through university landscaping, there were some very, very, very high-end landscaping jobs, and I worked for a very high-end landscaper, very, very high-end landscaping jobs in Yorkville.
In Yorkville.
So I spent quite a bit of time taking the deadheading flowers at nice restaurants, putting flower arrangements on tables, building a garden at the top of Hazelton Lanes.
I see.
But at the same time, there were other things like Ballinford Books. The architectural bookstore was still long gone, of course, but Ballinford was still in Yorkville, so you would go to Ballinford. There were still a couple clubs. I can remember we used to go quite a bit to see a band called Manteca. That was upstairs in a restaurant. So it was still a very hip place. But through the 80s, the difference was that it wasn't people who look like me. In the 80s, it started to be people who looked pretentious, people who were well-dressed.
Okay.
Right? Now, I always used to think that they were secretaries pretending to be ad account managers and lawyers, assistants pretending to be partners.
Yeah.
I never got the impression that they were actually what they pretended to be. But Yorkville by then was a place that was starting to feel like there was a lot of money in it. And the other part about that I've been curious about, and I don't know that I know the answer to this, but one of the foundational bits of Yorkville that people forget is that before the hippies moved in, the Hungarians and Eastern Europeans moved in, and the coffee houses initially were run by them. And they were new immigrants, 50s and 60s immigrants from the Eastern Bloc. Well, that community got much richer. So I would also say that part of what was different, part of the rich people who were there in the 80s were wealthy Eastern Europeans who were now living in the suburbs and were coming down to Yorkville to go to clubs and restaurants and so on. But it was no longer hippie clubs. It was nice places to eat dinner where you would have conversation. It wasn't bars and bands and that sort of thing. So that was my experience sort of through the 80s. And we used to go there. I mean, we used to go there as a joke to see if we could meet people, because we thought it was funny that there were people who are kind of our age who looked so dressed up and we weren't, right? And so we always thought it was funny that there was, because it was still a very young crowd. I mean, it was still the 80s in Yorkville, I would have said, was still very young. But all of that stuff was starting to change then, of course. I mean, the Four Seasons had been built, the Hazleton Lanes had been built. So a lot of those places were gentrifying. And also by the 80s, TIFF was there, right? The Toronto International Film Festival. So for 2 weeks of the year in September, you could wander around and see famous people.
And this is when celebrities started coming to Yorkville.
Well, yes, celebrities started to come to Yorkville because the TIFF headquarters was there. Many of them stayed at the Windsor Arms, which is just across Bloor Street. Some of them stayed in the Four Seasons. And then there's that fancy new hotel that was built. But so that was also in the 80s. During that couple of weeks that the film festival was on, you could see all kinds of famous American actors. But that was only for a very short period of time, right?
As an architect, how do you feel about Yorkville in general? Like architecture, identity, memory, history.
So it's an interesting challenge because by and large there's almost no fabric, actual built fabric left. What's left is scale. So the buildings are still one down, two up. One down retail, maybe an office or something on the second floor. And those buildings are quite distinctive, and they still maintain a bit of the street. They're very street oriented. They allow it to be a very pedestrian oriented street and area still. With the changes that are happening now, I think that probably won't last very much longer. So,
by changes, what do you think specifically?
Specifically, well, so Hazleton Lanes was for the rich people, but when we built Hazleton Lanes Part 2 when I was at Diamond & Schmidt in the late 90s, that was for silly rich people. And that building is now undergoing renovations for silly rich people. And so there's a real change in the demographic that you see. I mean, you go down there now on a Saturday and you'll see Lamborghinis and Ferraris and those sorts of things. Even in the period in the 80s, where I always thought that it was a bit over the top. you never saw that. And I also think, I mean, so I think there are sensitive condos. So like the condo that was built where the old Mount Sinai hospital was, that's behind that was by Harari Pontarini. That one maintains the scale of the street, and it has a tower that's back. The tower's not very big. It feels respectful to me. It's very much like, so across the street, WZMH did a project in the 60s where they left a couple of the Victorian houses, and then they built a building that had angled skylights, north-facing skylights that went all the way up, and that's where WZMH had its office at one point. So the first time I dropped my resume off at WZMH, it was at that building. So it's Cumberland Square, I think it's called Cumberland Square is the building, 99 Yorkville, 98 Yorkville, something like that. And so that's a building where they maintained some of the context in the front and then wrapped a U of bigger stuff behind it. Of course, there's the famous building by Diamond and Myers, York Square, which is, so now that's the part that's depressing. So York Square is going to be torn down and replaced by a 100-story rich people condo. Several of the parking garages that are in Yorkville are being torn down